The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, my name is Trish Kerrin. I hope you can all hear me now. Today's webinar is about why training is not enough when it comes to competency. I'll be running through a series of slides here and then you'll have a chance to ask questions at the end. If you've got questions to ask, please use the questions box in your navigation pane as part of the GoToWebinar, and you can just type your question in there. I will also be checking the chat box to make sure if any questions do pop up in the chat box. And if you have any problems at all with any of the audio or anything else that's going on, then please just send me a message through the chat box. So as I said, my name is Trish Kerrin and I'm the director of the iChemie Safety Centre. Competency to me is a really important topic because over many years of my career, it's an area that I've done a bit of work in. I have trained as a workplace trainer and assessor and in some adult education aspects as well to make sure that we can use the right strategies we need to use to drive process safety competency in the workplace. And I chose this little cartoon on the front page here because I thought it was actually important to reiterate that when we start out in something, we're what's called unconscious incompetence. We don't know what we don't know. We then start to move and progress through and we become conscious of our incompetence. We start to realize that we don't know some things. Then we move on to conscious competence, and this is when we have to make active efforts to try and do a particular task that we do. So we're conscious that we know we're competent in something. And lastly, we become unconsciously competent. And this is an example of where you just know how to do it. And it's now second nature to you. You just keep doing it. And in everything we do in life, we actually progress through these 4 stages. And so it's important to always just come back and sometimes think about where we might be at a particular stage in our career or in our life even, for what's actually going on. So we'll kick off with the webinar now. Firstly, just wanting to acknowledge the Safety Centre member companies. Without their support and their membership, we could not do the work that we do. And some of you will have noticed that since the world has entered a COVID somewhat isolation period, we've been very, very active in doing these sorts of webinars to keep providing good quality continuing professional development information for people. Also important to acknowledge our university partners. These are the organisations that we work very active with in trying to engage and provide resources for the future engineers so we get better quality engineers in terms of process safety understanding when they graduate. Now, when we talk about process safety, some of you may have heard this slide before. We talk about leadership as being a key element across 6 areas in an organisation. So knowledge and competence, engineering and design, systems and procedures, assurance, human factors and culture. Now, all of these areas are absolutely critical to deliver good process safety outcomes. Interestingly, all but one of these areas is about people. The one that's really about the traditional engineering activities that we've often thought about process safety being related to is engineering and design. But even to an extent, that's about people too. So today we're going to talk about knowledge and competence in particular. And I think this is really topical at the moment because we have, in some instances, time on our hands. So this is an opportunity to increase our knowledge and skills in a particular area. But we've also got the ability to be tapping into all sorts of different information and indeed all sorts of different industries at the moment as well. And that's a really important thing too. How can we take our current competency that we may have in one particular field and potentially transfer that into a different field or a different industry? Because some of us, unfortunately, may be in that situation of needing to move into a different industry or a different job at this particular point in time as well. So hopefully you'll get some good tips on how to actually do that in this process too. So first of all, what is training? So I decided to go to the dictionary to look up a definition. So training is a noun. It's the process of learning the skills you need to do a particular job or activity. So this is a really key bit about building the knowledge and the skills at an early stage. So if that's what training is, then what is competency? Or what is competence? Competence is also a noun. It's the ability to do something well. So really, it builds on. We've got this process of learning the skills we need to do a job, and then the ability to do it well. This is what it's about in progressing from training through to competence. So let's talk about training. Training needs to be set. It needs to set the context and expectations for learning. So what are we trying to teach people when we do that particular training activity? That's a really important part of what we need to understand. It's also important that we should have very clear training outcomes or learning outcomes defined before we actually even start the process of training. If we don't have learning outcomes defined, then how do we know whether we ever got to the outcome? So most training courses you will see will always start with talking about clear learning outcomes. Now, this webinar, I haven't talked about learning outcomes. That's because this is actually not a training course. This is part of an other experience type activity. There aren't clear learning outcomes to be gained from this particular webinar, but there are experiences that you can gain from participating in this webinar. The training needs to meet the learner's requirements, things like language, literacy, and numeracy. And this is often something that certainly professional trainers and learning and development professionals talk about this thing all the time. LLN, you'll often hear them talk about it. But in industry, we probably don't talk about it enough, in fact. And some of the challenges we have here is if we're working in a diversified workforce where we have people with different language skills and different first languages, then what information are we providing to them in a language that they can easily understand? So a core tenet of safety management is that we should be providing information for people in their native language. If that is not English, then we need to be providing information in a language that they can understand. So that's a key part of understanding it. Literacy and numeracy is also really important as well. Depending on what our audience, our target audience, who our audience is, will change the literacy level potentially that we might be looking at. But even so, I think it's always a really good rule of thumb that unless you're writing a specifically technical document, you probably should assume around about year 10 high school education literacy for people. Because actually we don't need to be spending our brain effort trying to understand a really complexly worded document if it could be worded quite simply. So it's not to assume that people don't have literacy, but actually let's not pretend that everybody needs to use really, really long syllables, words with long syllables to try and communicate something when there is a simpler way potentially to communicate it. And numeracy as well, depending on what we're expecting the recipient to do with the material. Do they have the numeracy they need to understand the different aspects of the task that they're doing potentially? So it's always important just to reflect back whenever we're doing something, are we meeting the LLN needs of the trainee? And all of these things help form a basic understanding of the task or requirement that we're trying to get people to do. So they're really important aspects to consider. And that's why without understanding these points before you go into developing any training program for your workforce or starting to even undertake a training program yourself, if we don't go in with these understandings up front, we can get caught out and not meet the objective that we're trying to meet at that point. So if that's what training's about, then how do we transition to competence? So learned skills must be experienced and practiced to become competent. So how can we increase people's the ability to do the skills by giving them the opportunity to practice and do what they need to do? So an example I've got here is something that probably most of us take for granted and do, driving of a car. So when it comes to becoming competent in driving a car, the first thing we do is obtain our learner's permit. So we might need to study, take a written test to show that we have a basic understanding of the road rules. So we're demonstrating that we have some knowledge here. But then we actually start to drive under the supervision of a licensed driver. This is where we start to get experience, we start to practice, we get coached along the way. Then we pass our practical test, hopefully, and we obtain our provisional or probationary type license. So now we've built some fundamental knowledge, we've had some coaching and some practice along the way, and now we actually get to go and do that ourselves. So this is when we actually continue to gain more experience by actually driving. And we can think about this in a slightly different way. We can think about it as learning through education is the study we need to do to take the written test for our learner's permit. Learning through others is where we drive under supervision of a licensed driver. This is where we're coached and mentored along the way. And learning through experience is we can now get behind the wheel and go driving our car by ourselves. From a workplace training perspective and a process safety training perspective, we can actually look at these as well. So learning through experience, this is where we expand our scope of work. We start to apply our learning in real situations, and we can learn through new experiences that we may have. Learning through others is where people might give us feedback. We might have mentoring or coaching sessions. And it's important to note here that it says both giving and receiving. There's an enormous amount of value in being a mentor as well as being mentored. So if you have the opportunity to be a mentor for someone, I would suggest it's a really useful process for you to undertake as a learning and development activity yourselves. And there are various communities we can engage with, industry groups, engineering institutions such as ICME, which we're all from here today. Different forums and conferences as well, attending webinars, those sorts of things. That's where we get the chance to learn through others. And then, as I said, that learning through education part. So the formal training or individual training and education, where we might go and do a training course. Professional qualifications or accreditations. So your professional qualification, if you're an engineer, might be that you got your engineering degree to start with. It might be now that you're progressing through to being a chartered engineer and working through that process as well. So that is the learning through education part. Okay, so a model for learning then. How do we deal with this? Back in the 1980s, Lombardo and Eichner stated that they believed that learning was based on a 70-20-10 model. And what that meant was 70% is knowledge from job-related experiences, 20% is from interaction with others, and the last 10% is those formal educational events. Now, over many years, this research has been disputed and challenged. The reason for that is mainly because there was actually no evidence to support it. It was a theory that was not researched from an academic perspective. However, I think you'll agree from practical experience that this does kind of seem right about how we learn and become competent in something. Whether it is 70-20-10 or whether it is a different split, whether it's 60-20-20, for example, I don't know. But I think the rough magnitude of it is probably about right. We learn the basis in our educational activities and events, and then we get coached and mentored, and then we get practice and experience. And it makes sense that that split is probably about right, though there is no academic research to prove that it's right. But nonetheless, we've decided to apply this sort of model, not the split itself, but this sort of model going forward within the ICME Safety Centre and in our competency guidance documents. So back originally in 2015, we published a process safety competency guidance. In 2018, we released edition 2 of that document. And this document actually talks about the different levels of competence required depending on what task or role you have within an organisation. And it plots out the competence matrix from basic awareness to skilled application or mastery or proficiency. So that has 18 different competencies stated within that document. And since then, we've produced a document that is a supplementary guide to this. And it actually talks about that how to get your experience through education, experience through others, parts of it. So this is broken down into those 3 different aspects for each of the competencies. We currently have 18 competencies in the first document, and all of the ones shown here in bold are currently released within the supplementary guide. Later this year, the supplementary guide will have the remaining 10 competencies all documented within there as well. So in the next few months, we'll actually be releasing an updated supplementary guide that will cover all 18 of these competence topics. So what does it look like? So if we look, for example, at hazard identification and risk assessment. So the learning through education part, as I said, whether that's 10% or 20%, it's probably not really relevant what the actual percentage is, but what's important is there is a fundamental underpinning learning through education part that is required. So at the competence level 1, it might be as simple as undertaking the site induction, for example. To get to basic application, which is level 2, then we'd be looking at, well, they might be starting to have the basic awareness level plus some risk assessment courses potentially. The next level up, we're now starting to look at maybe HAZOP leader course, some higher level courses. And in that skilled competency level 4, that mastery or expert level, then we're starting to look at, well, perhaps we are starting to write peer-reviewed articles about risk assessment. So we're starting to progress our way up in terms of how we progress through that education process. The next one about the learning from or through others. So here is where we would start to have discussions about the effectiveness of risk assessments. But then in that next level 2, we're starting to learn during the application from the leader. So we're gaining some experience and learning how things are done by participating in activities now and being coached. We might then start mentoring junior staff as part of our skill development in this space. And then lastly, potentially mentoring more senior people, maintaining connections with industry groups and those sorts of things, and engaging with other people in that space. And then the learning through experience. So this is where we actually get more hands-on experience. And the more experience we get, and it's not just the more in terms of number of hours, it's the more in terms of quality as well. So you don't progress up in this particular topic, for example, by attending 20 HAZOPs. Your contribution level to those HAZOPs is what provides the experience level. So by just attending HAZOPs does not mean you all of a sudden become competent in doing HAZOPs or even leading HAZOPs. But participating in them, challenging, entering the discussion, raising questions, raising issues, that is participating in the HAZOP. And that is where the quality of the interaction comes out, and that learning through others' experience is really, really important at that point. So it's interesting to, if we think about how all of that comes together, then what does capability mean? Because sometimes we see in organisations people refer to capability. There might be a capability matrix for an organisation, for example. Capability is really about having the right people in the right jobs at the right time. So what that means is, do you have competent people in the tasks at the right time, understanding that as we've gone through, it takes time to build competence. You are not competent the first day you walk into a new job. The only way that could happen is if you've done that job before and you've got that experience, because remember, we need the experience building to become truly competent in this. So organisational capability is important to understand that if we've got an organisation full of people that don't have the experience in their jobs, then we're probably lacking in capability. We need to do something about that then potentially. And capability can be partly managed through supervision as well. So if we don't have the organisational capability embedded with the people in their roles, maybe we need to have more supervision at that time as well. So really, capability is having the resource with the competence to do the job at the right time. And the resource can be dependent on recruitment, retention, and succession planning as well. So how are we planning for succession in our organisations? Now, this is a particularly important topic to talk about at the moment with all the changes that we're seeing in industry and in the way that we operate our facilities at this particular point in time. So, how are we doing our succession planning if we have some key critical roles that become unwell and are unable to work, or are actually just physically unable to get to the place where they need to be potentially? It might be offshore, for example, and they are stranded in one country and they can't get to another to get offshore. We've seen some of these things occur at this particular point in time as nations close borders. So we need to make sure that we've got all of those things thought about in our succession planning and our resource planning so that we've got the people we need to do the jobs we need at the right time. There's a couple of key principles to think about in terms of competence as well. It's always really important to have assurance linked to key responsibilities, activities and tasks. So you need to be checking that the key responsibilities, activities and tasks are being done and they're being done adequately to give us the level of assurance we need, particularly in process safety systems. Those assurance systems need to be established and maintain the competency for all those involved. So that is around having succession planning, having training matrices, and then having the opportunity for people to do the experience activities they need to do at that point. And as I've been talking about in this presentation, training is important, but it's not sufficient on its own. We can't just have a whole lot of people going out there that may have a particular training qualification, but not have experience in what they're doing. And an example I think that probably most of us have seen or been through is we graduate with an engineering degree and we go into the workplace. Well, you don't typically see engineering departments just full of graduate engineers and no one else. They have more experienced engineers there as well. They're the ones that are there to teach us, to keep us on the straight and narrow, and to help us develop as engineers, where we do get that consolidation through practice. Competence needs to take into account all the foreseeable work and operating conditions as well. So we need to be trained in what can go wrong and what we will do about it if it does go wrong. So this is part of our risk assessments. It's part of our emergency response training as well, part of our troubleshooting activities. Training and assessment methods need to be appropriate to the hazard profile. So there may well be far more training and experience to be gained when we're doing a safety critical task than when we're doing a task that actually does not have any safety or potentially product quality implications, for example. On-the-job training needs to be structured and linked to risk assessments. So we've got we've done our initial training where we get our knowledge. Now we get to do our on-the-job training, but we need to make sure that that training is linked to the risk assessments so that we don't inadvertently create an incident by doing something because we didn't know what we were doing and the risk assessment hadn't been understood at that point in time. It needs to be validated and recorded. If we don't record that the training happened, it actually never happened, as far as I'm concerned. If it's not written down, it never happened. And we really need to make sure that we do become quite disciplined in that. That's not to say that we need to enter a box ticking mentality. We don't want to be at that particular situation where all we're doing is just ticking the box and filling in forms, and we're drowning under the bureaucracy of paperwork. The bureaucracy of paperwork never saved anybody from any incident. But it is important to make sure we can assess whether we have the right competence levels in an organisation at a particular point in time. We do need refresher training on certain activities. So there will be various different instances where we do have to do refresher training on things to make sure that we have maintained the competency, partly because we can slip into complacency over time as well. As we go through the car driving example, if you were to give me a test today about all the different road rules, if I was to sit the learner's test, would I pass it? I've been driving for well over 25 years. But would I pass that test today? I don't know. Would I pass a driving test today with the bad habits that have slipped in over my life as driving. That could be an impact as well. So refresher training can really help to iron out some of those bugs that we have in our training processes that they slip in. And when we're the people coaching and training others, we can then train them and develop them to do the wrong things. They can pick up our bad habits. So we need to make sure we try and iron out those bad habits when we can. Vocational qualifications need to include site-specific aspects. So this might be where we're talking about our tradespeople, and they will do their apprenticeship, but they still need to understand the site-specific aspects. So even if they're an electrician that is specialised in industrial electrical systems, they still need to understand the safety aspects of a particular site. They need to know where the hazardous areas are so that they can make sure they maintain all the hazardous equipment appropriately, for example. You need to get this balance right between competence and supervision, and you could also say between capability and supervision as well. There will be some times where we have departments or groups that are lower in competence than where we would want them to be. That can be offset with competent supervision. And likewise, if we have very competent groups, we may well be able to reduce the supervision a little bit. It's a dynamic relationship that needs to be monitored over the life of the activity, the project, or the facility that we're working, because it will change depending on people coming and going out of the teams and depending on the complexity of the tasks. And these two things can be used to offset each other. And outsourcing and the use of contractors, we can do that, but we still need to make sure that they are competent. Now, this doesn't mean that you need to be checking the competence in terms of, for example, if you need to bring in some experts to do some non-destructive testing of a pipeline, so they're going to go out and do some X-rays on some welds. You don't need to be an expert on how to do the X-rays. You're bringing people in to do that. But you need to check that those people have qualifications. You don't necessarily need to be expected to understand precisely what they're going to do. You need to understand some of the big picture risks to make sure all the risks are taken into account and managed adequately. But you still need to keep an overview of that whole activity that's happening. But you don't need to be the expert taking the X-ray shot of that particular pipeline. So I mentioned earlier that we may be in a situation now where people are looking at moving to different roles or different activities, different organisations, different industry sectors. So what can you personally do in that space? Well, first of all, you need to take stock of your own competence. Where are your gaps today? If you take a look at the original Safety Centre guidance document, you'll be able to pick out your sort of job role in that matrix. And then you'll be able to see what level of competence you should have in process safety according to the guidance document that we developed. Now, I'm not saying this guidance document is perfect and accurate. It is moving and being adjusted regularly. It's the best we had at the time, taking into account feedback from people around the world in industry today about where they thought the competency should be. So take a look and see where your gaps are. And then you want to develop an action plan and look for opportunities to undertake some of that activity, whether it is doing a training course or whether you are moving into, you've got that formal education in something, now it's around learning off others and learning through experience. So how can you take on some of those activities? That's where the second document that we've got comes in. This actually talks about what the learning through others looks like and what the learning through experience looks like as well. And when you actually understand and keep track of where you're at with your own competency, and if you're a supervisor, with that of your team as well is very important, you can start to see where you might have some transferable skills. And this is an important thing at the moment, as I said. For example, you might be working in the oil industry or recently have left the oil industry, and you're thinking, well, I want to go and work in food production, for example. There will be some knowledge and skills and competence that you've developed over the years of your working through others and working through experience, learning through experience, that are transferable. So you need to take a step back and think about the nature of the hazards, not the specific aspect of the hazards. So it might be that you're used to dealing with natural gas, and that may not be as applicable, obviously, but there may be other flammable gases that are used in the food industry. An example here would be ammonia. Ammonia is quite substantially used within the food industry. So there are clearly transferable knowledge from potentially managing safety when it comes to oil and gas industry versus food industry, because there is some crossover substances and chemicals that do exist in that space. So that was what I wanted to cover in terms of the actual presentation. What I will put up now is all of our contact details. And if you go to our website, icmesafetycentre.org, and you click on the publications section, all of the documents that I've talked about today are available free as a download from that particular website. So you can go in there, you can download, you can access this material. It is available for anybody to take on and use. You can also follow us on our social media channels, where we produce a lot of useful information for people, particularly in the knowledge and competence space, learning materials, whether it's lessons learnt bulletin, which from a language literacy and numeracy perspective, for example, we cover its availability in written English, in written Spanish, because that is a very popular language that's been requested, but we also have it in a conversational English podcast. Again, because some people take their information in by listening, some people prefer to take it in through reading, some people prefer to take it in through visual means. So every one of our lessons learnt bulletins is available through the written mode, as I said, the podcast mode, and also a webinar that's available off our YouTube channel or our website as well. So I'm happy to take any questions that you may have at this particular point in time. This webinar is being recorded, and it will be posted on our website and our YouTube channel, so you'll be able to go back and view it at any stage in the future. And as I said, you'll be able to download the documents I've spoken about directly from our website. Are there any questions at all at this stage? No questions? This might be a very quick webinar. Okay. Someone's asked a question. I'd like to know how you can integrate safety into the curriculum. Okay, if you go to our website on the publications page, you'll see, and we've also got another section on our website called Educational Resources. We have actually developed a series of learning outcomes that we would like to see available to students in university when they're doing their engineering degrees. And we've defined these learning outcomes using Bloom's taxonomy, which is how universities define learning outcomes. So we've used the right language so that it clearly translates and slots into the educational area. We've also developed a series of different resources to help universities teach process safety. So it's up to universities to develop their own curricula and to develop their own materials for teaching, but we can provide some resources to them that might be useful. So one of the things that we have created, for example, is a simplified safety management system for university laboratory activities. And this focuses on teaching people the fundamental basics of operational process safety, because you can think of a laboratory activity as being a small-scale operational plant. And it's a really useful way to be able to show how things like permit to work, management of change, operational handover can all function in an environment, and people can start to get experience with them. So that is a clear way that we've tried to help universities to integrate that into the curriculum. So I hope that answers your question there. Other questions we've got coming in. Are all your member companies implementing this framework? Some of them are, and I'm aware of some companies that are not members that are also implementing this framework. So different organisations have different different ways that they manage their competence, and we see people pick up parts of it, and our document is written very specifically so that you can pick up little bits of it if that's just the bit you need to plug the gap. We don't suggest that you have to take the whole thing and embed the whole thing exactly as it is. We've written it in such a way that it should fit into other organisations' systems quite streamlined. Do the competency elements or subjects consider others, i.e. Engineers Australia framework? Well, the Engineers Australia framework, to my knowledge, is not process safety specific. This is a process safety specific competency framework. We did take into account the other safety centres around the world and the work they had done in process safety competency, and built that in and built on to the next level of the work that had been done in that space. We're getting lots of questions coming in now, so I just have to work my way through them. What's best practice for tracking the training and competence? So in this instance, you need to make sure that you've just got a system that is easy for you to input data into and schedule out of. So whatever management system software you are using in your organisation, there are many good quality systems out there that you can use. It's actually about having the discipline to keep using that particular program that you're using. So there's no one that's specifically better than the other. You just need to make sure that you're using a suitable system that works for your organisation. Okay, I've got another question. Do the Safety Centre provide different process safety incident investigation reports for educating plant engineers and operators? So we do have a range of different activities and resources that we provide, ranging from little short, less than 1 minute videos on a particular incident to highlight what the issues were that you can use in a toolbox training activity, for example, with the operators, all the way through to the detail in our guidance documents. And in between, we've got things like our lessons learnt bulletin, the safety law, which actually talks about it talks about some incidents that have occurred, and then it talks about if you are the manager of this site, what do you need to do to prevent that incident happening to you? If you're the engineer or supervisor, what do you need to do? Or if you're the operator or maintainer, what do you need to do? So we actually cover off in that way. So there's a range of different resources. I'd encourage you to take a look at our website. All of our guidance documents are a free download from there. What is the relation between competence and culture? Sometimes people have the knowledge but still violating. Can we use same steps to build the culture? Okay, so what I would suggest in this instance is you need to understand why people are not following the process that you want them to follow. And this is where human factors comes into it. Is it actually simple for them to follow the process? They might know the procedure, but if the procedure is overly complicated and difficult to do, then humans will find a way to simplify it and work around it. So if someone's not following a procedure, yes, that is a cultural related issue, but it's not so much only a cultural related issue about the person not following the procedure. It's the culture of the organisation that developed a procedure that was too hard to follow. So I would suggest there is a linkage there, but you need to go back and understand if someone's not doing what you want them to do, why? Because people don't, on the whole, want to do the wrong thing. We come to work each day in an effort to do our job and do it to the best of our ability. There's only a very, very, very small percentage of people that don't do that. So if someone's not getting their job right for some reason, look at the job. It's all about human factors in this instance, which is where the task, the organisation and the person intersect. That is what human factors is about. We've got some good webinars on human factors on our YouTube channel if you want to take a look at those to learn a little bit more there. How do you determine the competence level that staff are currently functioning at? Wow, that's a really tough question. It's going to depend on all sorts of different aspects. What particular task are you looking at? What are the learning outcomes? What are the required competency levels of people to achieve? So there's no one-size-fits-all answer to this. You're going to need to look at a range of different aspects around what is the competency you're looking at and what do you need them to be doing before you can then start to understand what their competence level is. So if you liken it to when you do a training course, for example, there will be a marking guide of how the trainer will mark whether someone is deemed to have met the requirements or met the learning outcomes at the end. You need to define what those learning outcomes are. Then you can assess people against those. So it's not just a matter of only assessing against what you think the learning outcomes are. You actually need to document them and give people a chance to meet them, a chance to know what they are, so they can then meet them. And they should be documented in things like their position descriptions or their development plans in an organisation. Someone's asked about the CCPS certification program for PSM. I can't talk to that. As part of the ICME Safety Centre, we do not have anything to do with the CCPS certification program. You would have to actually ask the AICHE about that particular program. ICME itself does have the Professional Process Safety Engineer registration, which is a different program that we've had out for a number of years now. And you can certainly find more information on the ICME website about that. More interesting about new facilities, e.g. following handover from construction to operators. Okay, so this is an interesting area because this is where we have the situation of potentially lower competence levels because people are new to either the role completely or the facility they're at. Here's where we then need to start to look at the supervision levels and how we can actually manage the handover of knowledge and information. So if it's a new facility, we should have a documented basis of safety for it so we understand what the safety aspects are. Then we can actually start to develop the training based on the basis of safety and the design philosophy so we understand how it's meant to work. There'll be an operational philosophy as well as a maintenance philosophy. We need to understand all of these aspects and they need to be turned into the training modules to do the start of that learning through education bit. Supervisors will then help us get through that learning through others, and then it is a matter of learning through experience again. The membership of the Safety Centre, of the ICME Safety Centre, is for companies only, but individuals obviously can become members of ICME. How do we develop critical thinking, which is extremely important in process safety as part of competence? Yeah, that is a difficult one. Developing people's critical thinking takes a lot of effort and a lot of training, but it is very important. And we need to help people develop that critical thinking skill by providing them with the right information so they can actually interpret what they're being told or what they're reading or what they're interpreting from their control systems. And it's about trying to encourage people to question what they're seeing, be curious. That's really what critical thinking is about. It's about being curious about what's going on around you and thinking, does that make sense? Or is it not quite right? Is there something I can learn from it? I did a session earlier today with a series of university students, and one of the things I talked about was we need to do things like use storytelling. Storytelling is an interesting way for humans to learn and to share information with each other. And it can be quite engaging when we're doing the storytelling activity. People get interested, they get curious. It's a great way to get people curious about learning and about process safety. So storytelling is a really important way to pass on that competence. Is there an international framework for assessors of competency? Not that I am aware of. Yeah, I can't answer that specifically. I'm not aware of one. When should we conduct refresher training and what should it be, the whole training or just a summary? That's going to depend on what the particular skill is, how often it's used, how critical it is. So there's no one answer here. Some things may need to be refreshed, for example, annually, and other things might not need to be refreshed until 5 years' time. It depends on the risk that the task presents, as well as how frequently they do it. If it's a task people are doing very, very frequently, you don't need to refresh it as often potentially than a task that's quite rare. You want to make sure people are comfortable when that rare task comes up. Who is best responsible for training, the leader or the training department? Well, I would actually say it's the individual. We need to take control of our own destiny to a certain extent, and we need to make sure that we're in charge of our own training requirements and needs, we need to be having those discussions with our supervisor. And the training department itself, I would suggest, are more like the safety department in a company. It's not the safety department's job to do safety. It's not the training department's job to do the training. They're there to provide resources and advice for you. It's not their job to do that sort of work. It needs to be with the individual within the line and the team supervisor. What's my opinion about using operational simulators to improve competency? I love that idea. I think it's a really good idea. I think we need to get better at doing it, though. I think simulators used to be very expensive, and so there weren't many of them. We're now starting to see more of them. And I think they're a great way, provided they give you the right pressure and intensity and stress that would go through a situation. The airline industry have been using simulators for a very, very long time to great effect. And I think industry should be using them a lot more. I can't recommend any specifically, but I think we should be doing more in the simulation space. Can I share any other tools to assess the competency and capability of an employee? Not specifically. Take a look at the guidance documents and see what's in there. They're quite useful in terms of understanding how to try and help people build that competence, which will then actually have the benefit of helping you understand how to assess them a little bit more. Do I have any training materials to help non-engineering senior managers to understand the difference between health and safety and process safety? Yes, we do. We actually have a specific program called Process Safety, Leadership and Culture, which is a one-day program aimed at very senior levels in an organisation. And a lot of that focuses on really understanding this difference between the two, and then looking at what we need to do to be able to lead and manage process safety specifically. So there is a number of different aspects to that particular training program, but there's also some other useful things that we have published. There's a resource called the OHS Body of Knowledge that is maintained by the Australian Institute of Health and Safety, but we've added 2 chapters in there about process safety, and there's one called Managing Process Safety and the other one is called Process Hazards Chemical. And both of them actually clearly define the difference between OHS and process safety, acknowledging there's an overlap, and talks about examples of when, for very good process safety reasons, something might get done that causes OHS issues, and likewise, for very good OHS reasons, something might be done that causes process safety issues. So the body of knowledge chapters are really useful in that. You can either look that up through the OHS Body of Knowledge, you can search for that on Google, or it is available from the ISC website under the publication section. Right balance between supervision and competence. Please explain that a bit more. It really depends. If you have a lower competence workforce, then you want to have more competent supervision. That might be more hands-on supervision, or it might just be a higher level of competence in the supervisor. Without explaining anything specific, it's a little bit harder to explain that in more detail. But when you have a more competent operator in your workforce, for example, you will know that the team leader of that group does not need to intervene as much. They do not need to monitor things as much. That's an example of where higher competence can lead to the need for, or can allow you to have a bit less supervision. But when you've got a brand new operator, you're going to make sure you've got a lot of supervision to teach them and train them, potentially catch any errors they might make. And this will change, and we need to be able to adapt in that dynamic environment as people's competence develops or, in fact, wanes if they're not doing something frequently enough. The next question is, how do you compare different safety standards and which is more relevant for the chemical process industries in Australia? And this is about CSP, which is a US one, versus NEBOSH. We've focused only on the process safety elements of it, and there is the CSP, for example, deals predominantly in OHS, as does NEBOSH. So this is actually around process safety, not OHS related. So there's less available from a process safety perspective in those other safety standards. Not to say they're not good standards, they are, but they don't cover the process safety aspect of it. So I think you actually need to be looking at both, to be honest. I don't think it's an either or. Asset integrity is an essential part of the model. What's your thought on asset integrity integration into the management system? I personally like integrated management systems because they bring everything together quite neatly into one system, but depending on your organisation will depend on whether an integrated management system works for you or whether a series of individual management systems work for you. It really is up to the company to determine how it wants to make it happen. But if you're going to have an integrated management system, I would suggest you can't leave out asset integrity from that. That needs to be part of it as well. That should be part of your it fundamentally should be part of your maintenance management system. But if you've got a fully integrated system, that should sit within the integration, not separate by itself and forgotten. Someone's just told me we've got a 404 error on our website. I am not sure why that is. Our website might be down. You might want to try it a little bit later. Competency versus experience in general, are there any conclusive studies that they might be directly correlated? Not that I have seen. I haven't read any academic studies on that space, so I can't answer that question. I'm sorry. Is there an edge for a fresh graduate having a vocational training or competency for employment? To be honest, a fresh graduate, if you do have vocational training and experience in another field, I don't think it will harm you in terms of your experience and your potential employability. It depends on what that vocational training is in, though. So if you are, for example, a mechanical fitter or an electrician and that's your vocational training and you go and do engineering, I'd say that would be quite a helpful aspect for you. If you are a trained chef and you go into engineering, it's probably less helpful to you. Education is always good, experience is always good, but it needs to be experience in the right areas to really be able to leverage off it, depending on where you're actually going. Process safety is a broad subject. Any gamification methods available to teach process safety elements at operator and entry-level engineers? There's a few areas that are coming up with gamification methods, and I think they are quite useful. An area that's not gamification that we have worked on is creating our safety centre case studies, and these actually focus on taking you through the experience of an incident where you won't suffer the consequences because you're completely safe in the environment, but we don't tell you what the consequences are either until we get to the end, and we ask you to make decisions along the way. So it's a way that you can become embedded within an organisation as an incident develops, and our case studies have been quite useful and very popular in that particular space as well. So that's one way to try and give people early experience of incidents or things that can go wrong to really have that that chance for them to learn without having to suffer the incident themselves. Do financial incentives or fines promote safety? Look, I'm not sure. I still think we're learning in this space. I think there does need to be ramifications when there is obviously something that is negligent or willful or failing to provide a safe place of work. And our laws certainly allow for that, and there are financial aspects to it. At the end of the day, if an organisation is purely only focused on avoiding an incident because of how much money it might cost them in a fine, then there's bigger issues in that organisation that need to be resolved than the initial safety incident that could happen. There's far more underlying cultural issues and ethical issues that I think you need to be working on first to try and deal with that. Someone has asked about for promotions, how do you manage competency? Should they have a competency matrix? I would suggest yes. We need to understand whether, as we promote people, do they have the entry level of knowledge to do the job? If not, how are you going to get them there? How are you going to develop them with a competency plan so they grow into the role and become competent in it? So I would suggest that that is important to have. Made a human factor evaluation with a set of parameters. However, as role and stress levels change, I've seen the response lower, but have seen two different trends. Based on experience, they rose. Based on younger group also, response was faster. However, the mid-group, the response, the reactivity time deteriorated. They will have similar competence, training and reinforcement. Okay, so there really is, you're potentially looking at some other underlying factors here around whether it is something to do with the human factors of how they're approaching the role, whether there's something else within their background that is leading to that. I would suggest that you probably need to dig a little bit deeper into your data and what you're seeing and understand why the different cohorts are responding differently. And look to try and figure out what that is. From the information, I can't really comment any further on that one, but take a look at the data. It sounds like you've got a fascinating study happening there. How do we develop competence of senior leaders in process safety, not training related? This is where they need to be willing to engage with other senior leaders and engage at that senior level. So some of the activities that we do in the Safety Centre, for example, is we run activities where we have senior manager briefings, where senior managers can come along and I will talk to them about a particular topic and start to raise their awareness. There are other instances where I'll go and sit down with companies and have a conversation with them at that senior level, discuss things at a board level. It's not a training course, it's actually a discussion where we learn from each other. There's some of the things that need to be encouraged that are not sending them on a training course. I hope that helps. Is there a point at which supervision hurts rather than helps, where the operator uses the supervision as a crutch rather than trusting their own training or knowledge? Yeah, I think there can be that. But that's where the supervision is not just about keeping an eye on people, it's actually about developing people and about starting to slightly pull away from that supervision as the person becomes more competent. Because if you are hovering over people and they don't need it, then they will come to rely on it. And, well, why should I bother thinking, because you're going to do it for me anyway? So it's not, as I said earlier, it's a dynamic situation to manage competence between supervision, and it will change. And a supervisor's role is not only to supervise, but also to develop. And they need to be developing that person's ability and their competence as they grow. And as that competence grows, the supervisor can slowly start to step back and give the person the opportunity and the permission to do the work, take the decisions themselves. Okay, do we carry out incident investigations like the CSB, for example? No, we don't. We are not an investigation agency. We often just refer to the work that the CSB do in that space, so we don't actually do any investigation work ourselves. Okay, as the industry moves more towards contracted work and less permanent positions, how do you maintain competency personally and share that with future employees? Part of that maintaining competency is doing things like attending these webinars. This is part of the learning through others aspect. And regularly sitting back, as you would do if you were in full-time and permanent employment with a company, you'd go through a development plan with your supervisor and you'd say where you want to be, how you're going to get there, what activities you're going to take to make that step. I would recommend, if you're not in a situation of doing that with your employer and you're in a contractor position, you still should be doing that same activity yourself. Take the chance to reflect. It's also part of how we document our continuing professional development as an engineer. We need to understand what CPD we're going to undertake in the next 12 months, for example, and what we're going to get out of it. What are we aiming? What are our learning objectives here? And start to document and keep track of that. And that's how you then have evidence to share that with future employers, but you've also got that experience so you can have that conversation and discuss it with people. And I think that's a really important thing, to keep record of your own development as well. Don't just only rely on your organisation to keep that record for you. So thank you very much for all of your questions. We've now hit our time limit. Thank you for your attention and certainly a lot of fantastic questions. I did get through basically all of them. I didn't read out the ones that were just comments around saying thank you. To those people, thank you very much for your feedback. Please take a look at our website. If you can't find it through ichemesafetycentre.org, just type in icheme.org, and up the top menu there is Safety Centre, and you can get to our website through there. So that should deal with that 404 error coming up. Thank you very much. Have a good afternoon, evening, day, wherever you are in the world, and please stay safe. Thank you.